Escobar, evangelist and servant of the Lord, originally from Ejidojicilpan in the municipality of Capita in the state of Chiapas, Mexico. I want to begin this testimony by sharing the words that marked my life from the beginning. It is convenient that I declare the wonders and miracles that the Almighty has done with me. Daniel 4:2. I also want to remind you what it says in Luke 1:37, because nothing is impossible for God. These words have been a constant truth in my life. A life marked by trials, errors, redemptions, and above all by the infinite power and mercy of God. I was born in the year 1900 in a very humble family. Since I was little, I witnessed the struggles that my parents faced. The material deficiencies were many, but the most intense battles seemed to be in their hearts and in the circumstances of life itself. However, something extraordinary happened when I was still a child. In the years 1988 and 1989, the Word of God reached our family. It was a transforming time. I remember as my parents received Jesus Christ into their lives, and from that moment our whole family began to walk the spiritual path, developing a personal relationship with the Lord. Despite my young age, that change was profound. My heart was filled with love for God, and I began to serve Him with dedication and commitment. My fervor was great and my life seemed to be heading towards a glorious purpose. However, as often happens, the years passed and the tests came in my adolescence. Although I tried to continue with my studies, an illness forced me to leave high school. This blow deeply discouraged me, and little by little I moved away from that first faith that I had embraced with such fervor. During that time of distance, I began to fall into the vices and temptations that often lurk for young people. Marijuana, cigarettes and alcohol became part of my life. What had begun as a small distraction became a lifestyle that consumed me little by little. At the same time, I turned to work with the hope of finding some meaning or stability, but this effort failed to fill the void that I felt inside me. I worked as a driver driving cars and trucks, and my time was completely absorbed by work responsibilities. I stopped attending church regularly, and when I managed to do so I felt disconnected. What was once a source of joy and communion with God had become tedious for me. I clearly remember how at 18 years old a servant of the Lord approached me with a message that was engraved in my soul. Thus say the Lord, because I have has mercy on you, I have forgiven your life. But one day I will show you what is my power. These words resonated in my mind and heart. Shortly before receiving them I had faced situations that put my life in danger, an accident with a truck that belonged to my father, and an assault in which I was attacked without suffering serious injuries. These were clear warnings from the Lord. However, although I recognized His intervention in my life, my heart remained cold and distant from His presence. Despite those experiences, I did not change my path. I continued traveling, working and looking for meaning in other places. I began to travel through various regions of the state of Chiapas, and later I ventured to other states of Mexico. For the year 2000 my travels took me to the north of the country, transporting cars from cities like Tijuana and Matamoros. I felt more and more involved in the routine, and my relationship with God continued being superficial. But God in His infinite mercy did not leave me to my fate. At a crucial moment a sister servant of the Lord received a revelation that shook me deeply. She saw an accident in which I lost my life, and next to me was someone who rejoiced in my misfortune. This vision awakened in me a deep fear, and although for a time I stopped driving, eventually I returned to my old habits. On April 26, 2004 I left Tijuana transporting 2 cars. My plan was clear: to arrive in Chiapas on the 28th and attend a relative's birthday on the 29th. Everything was planned in my mind, but I forgot what it says in James 4 verse 13 to 14. Those who say today and tomorrow we will go to such city and we will be there a year and we will traffic and we will earn, when you do not know what tomorrow will be. Because what is your life? Certainly it is a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. On my way, on April 27 I arrived at Zacatecas around 10 in the morning. Exhausted by the trip, I decided to rest while my companion took the wheel. Without knowing, I was about to face one of the most shocking moments of my life, an experience that would change everything forever. When we reached kilometer 145 of San Luis Potosi Highway, I never imagined that that stretch would be the scene of one of the most shocking moments of my life. At that point the vehicle we were towing suffered a tire failure. The impact was immediate, a deafening roar that marked the beginning of a series of events that can only be described as miraculous. I remember how the car began to lose stability. In a matter of seconds we left the road spinning uncontrollably. We headed towards a slope that I calculated would be at least 4 meters deep. While the car spun and the trailer pushed uncontrollably, everything became chaos. The bumps and jolts were constant. Every turn it seemed endless. As I was lying in the cabin of the vehicle I had no time to react or hold on. I was completely at the mercy of what was happening. At that moment my body was shaken brutally. I felt like my head hit repeatedly against the walls and roof of the vehicle. They were about 8 turns, each one worse than the last. Finally the two vehicles were pressed one on top of the other and I was trapped in the lower part, immobilized between the twisted irons. Everything around me was a chaos of shattered metal and dust. It was then that I experienced something that I had never experienced before. While my body remained trapped I began to feel a strange separation. My consciousness cleared and something inside me rose slowly, moving away from the scene. I saw my body from above, trapped between the rubble, inert and lifeless. It was as if my spirit was observing what was happening but from an external perspective. The heat of the sun burned intensely that midday and the cold wind contrasted with the scorching environment. However, I felt none of that. I was in a state that I cannot describe with human words. It was like being in a different body, without pain, without weight, in an indescribable peace. From this new perspective I could clearly see everything that was happening around me. In the distance I watched as the ambulances and rescue teams arrived. I saw the paramedics descend with their tools, struggling to access the vehicles. They worked tirelessly to make their way through the wreckage using metal bars and sought to cut the car and free my body. Despite the intensity of what was happening I did not feel anguish. Everything seemed so real but at the same time so distant. Suddenly something else caught my attention. In the distance a figure approached. He wore a great tunic that covered his body from head to toe. His walk was calm but his speed was inexplicable, as if he were slipping through space as he approached. I noticed he was carrying a sword in his hand, a sword that shone with a bright glow. This character walked determinedly where my body lay, but when he reached it an intense glow that surrounded it. He could not get through it. He turned around and went back, while the paramedics managed to extract my body from my elevated perspective. I observed how they placed it on a stretcher and took it to the side of the road. They covered my body with a white sheet, which for them was the definitive sign that there was no hope of life. However, I was still there watching everything. This was not a dream or a hallucination. It was something I was experiencing firsthand, something that God allowed me to experience. Suddenly I lost my vision when I became conscious again. I was in the General Hospital of Zacatecas, where they had transferred my body to perform the legal autopsy. The place was saturated with emergencies and my body was placed in a secluded area due to the number of patients. During the shift change of the medical staff, one of the doctors arrived to perform the last test of life. He used a defibrillator. He tried again and again. The third shock showed no signs of life. He insisted for the 4th, 5th and even 6th time. On the 7th my right foot moved. The surprised doctor immediately notified the hospital director. My body was transferred to perform tests. These revealed the extent of my injuries: fractures in the skull in 4 places, a broken rib, the spine broken in 3 points and a severe blow to the right leg. Despite everything, after 18 hours and 45 minutes my life returned. I opened my eyes in a state of immobility, connected to multiple probes and surrounded by doctors who could hardly believe what they were witnessing. The doctors stated that I only had 5 minutes to live. When finally my heart began to beat again, but inside me I knew that something bigger was happening. God had a purpose for my life, and what I was experiencing was just the beginning of a story of His infinite power and mercy. At that moment, while I remained motionless with probes in my body and surrounded by doctors who fought to keep me alive, I turned my head. I looked at the machine that monitored my heart. My eyes could barely focus, but I saw how the indicator slowly and painfully descended from 5 to 0. Each second that passed seemed eternal, and with each number that decreased the reality of my condition became more overwhelming. Time slipped through my fingers and the only thing I could do was watch as my life faded away. In those critical moments, A truth that I had ignored for so long struck my soul. I thought of all the moments in which I had had the opportunity to serve God, to give my life to honor Him as He deserves. However, what had I done? Had I postponed my commitment? Had I ignored His call? Had I allowed the distractions and worries of the world to take my heart away from Him? Now when time seemed to be running out, I was faced face to face with those decisions. The words of the doctors resonated in my ears like an endless echo. Let us do what we can. He was 5 minutes to live. That statement not only shook my body but also my spirit. It was as if my whole being understood that I was on the edge of eternity, and then like an unstoppable torrent, memories of all the sermons I had heard and discarded began to come to my mind. I remembered the altar calls, the sermons full of passion that spoke of an almighty God, the exhortations of the pastors that made me uncomfortable because they confronted me with my spiritual lukewarmness. Each one of those words that I had ignored accumulated in my mind like an unbearable weight. I remembered how the sermons that spoke of repentance bothered me. How I closed my heart when God called me to return to Him. Now all that made sense inside me. A voice was telling me why you were not faithful so many times. You had the chance but you chose the world. Now time is up. Those words pierced my soul. It was as if my conscience, my very being, was pointing out to me all the lost opportunities. All the moments in which I could have said, "Here is my life, Lord," but I didn't. I looked at the machine again. Time kept running and the monitor marked 20 before reaching 0. At that moment I saw one of the doctors leave the room shaking his head in defeat. Shortly afterward, the second doctor followed him. And then the third. I was left completely alone in that cold and silent room, facing the inevitable. My life, as I knew it, seemed to be over. However, as my body remained still, my mind clung to something greater than myself. The words of a servant of the Lord came back to me with a clarity I had never before experienced. For I have had mercy on you, I have spared your life, but one day you will know my power. It was as if those words had been spoken for this very moment. A flash of hope arose in my spirit, and from the depths of my being, I uttered the words that would change my life forever. Lord, if you live, I want to know your power. That declaration was not an act of desperation but a total surrender. For the first time I recognized that I had no control over my life, that only God could do something in the midst of my situation. Through tears I made a sincere commitment to Him. Lord, if you heal me, whatever it costs me, I will preach your word. These words not only came from my lips but they flowed from the deep in my heart. I continued, Lord, if you heal me, I will never sell your word. And I added, if I preach your word and you support me, I will not allow pride to take over me. At that moment something inexplicable happened. Through my half-open eyes I saw how the ceiling of the hospital opened, and a lightning bolt descended from the heavens. A bright light pierced the ceiling, and in the middle of that light a shining cloud appeared. In the center of the cloud a majestic character descended. His clothes were of a whiteness that I cannot compare with any fabric in this world. Neither the finest material nor the most elegant design could match his splendor. His presence radiated a peace and a holiness that surpassed any human understanding. The character approached my right side, placed his right hand on my chest and his left hand on the back of my head. At that moment an indescribable tenderness filled my being. I felt like his touch. Not only did his gaze reach my physical body but also my soul, full of love and compassion. It penetrated to the depths of my being. Although I could not hold his gaze completely due to his magnificence, his presence enveloped me in a tranquility that I had never known at that moment. My body could not resist any longer and I went into a coma again, but something inside me knew that it was not the end. While time went by and the doctors continued to fight to keep me alive, my family, who had already been informed of my situation, began to intercede for me from my home in Chiapas. My brother arrived at the hospital and my church did not stop crying out. God spoke through prophecies assuring them that my life was in His hands. Do not worry, as you saw him leave, you will see him return. I am doing something in his life. While the doctors affirmed that there was no longer any hope, God was writing a different story in the midst of that struggle between faith and science. The Christ who can do everything began to work, because as Luke says chapter 1 verse 37, nothing is impossible for God. there where you are now, at home in a hospital bed or listening to these words. By any means I want to speak to you directly. Maybe you are facing a situation that seems impossible. Maybe science has told you that there is no hope anymore, that your condition has no remedy, but let me tell you something important. God is with you right now with his hands extended towards you, saying, here I am. At this very moment he is at your side, ready to do what no doctor or technology can achieve, because when the doors close he has the power to open them. In my case, the news for my family was devastating. They heard constantly that there was nothing to do, that my situation was irreversible, but God spoke to them through his word and told them, I have it in my hands. While the doctors declared that everything was lost, the Lord firmly repeated, do not worry, because I am working. Two completely opposite realities. The words of the doctors and the promises of God collided. One thing is to believe in God, but another very different thing is to believe God in the midst of adversity, when everything seems lost. In those critical days after having become unconscious, I briefly regained consciousness. I felt as if I were floating between two worlds, life and death. I saw a doctor come in who examined my body seriously. The minutes passed and he checked the monitors and made calls asking for a specialist to come and check my condition. While all this was happening, I realized that I could speak with a small voice. I told the doctor, don't worry, I'm fine, I'm healthy. My statement was received with disbelief. The doctor looked at me as if I was delirious. He even put a tape on my lips to prevent me from speaking, thinking that my mind was confused by weakness. The doctors continued to work diligently, but they could not understand what was going on inside me. My condition was critical, and the accumulation of blood in my brain that had already been there for 3 days was a mortal risk. The specialists administered stronger medications to try to dissolve the clot. Meanwhile, I felt the presence of God filling every part of my being. I wanted to talk to them, testify that I served a Christ of power, but they did not let me. One of them even said he is delusional, weakness has affected him. But I knew the truth. The Christ who rose lives and was working in my lifetime was moving. On the 5th day after the accident, the doctors came to an inevitable conclusion. It was necessary to operate on me. My family was informed that the surgery was extremely risky. They explained to me that if I managed to survive, I would probably be left with severe brain damage or even in a vegetative state. Those words fell like a bucket of cold water on my heart. I tried to protest, begging them not to operate on me. I told the doctors I prefer to die, let me go home with my family to say goodbye. But the doctors insisted the procedure was essential and everything was ready to be performed. The next day, the night before the operation, my mind was flooded with dark thoughts. I imagined myself losing my abilities, depending on others for everything. I thought about how my brothers could feel me as a burden, how they would see me as someone who needed constant care. These ideas hurt me deeply. The fear was not only physical but emotionally. I did not want to face that reality. On the 7th day they prepared me for the operation. They tied me to the stretcher, and while they took me to the operating room, my heart was full of despair, but deep inside my spirit kept crying out in my mind. I prayed to the Lord, Lord, I prefer to die. Please do not allow me to remain in this state. If this is the end, receive me in your presence. It was a prayer full of pain but also of total surrender. While they approached me to the operating room, something unexpected happened. I felt a different energy in the environment. I raised my gaze and once again I saw how the ceiling of the hospital opened as if it were an invisible curtain. A lightning crossed the place, illuminating everything with a glow that no earthly light can match. At that instant the character I had seen before went down again. His robe shone even more than the first time, and his presence filled the room with an authority that everyone could feel. The character extended his right hand towards me and touched my forehead. At the exact moment when his hand made contact, I felt an electric shock that ran through my entire body. A supernatural heat filled every cell and my heart began to beat with a renewed force. At the same time I heard a roar. The hospital equipment began to fail. The cameras and monitors were turned off, and a short circuit interrupted the entire electrical system in the operating room. The doctors were stunned. I sat on the stretcher feeling like a supernatural force filled me. I began to expel through my mouth the coagulated blood that had been accumulating in my brain for days. What the doctors had planned to extract with an operation. God did it in an instant. I looked at the doctors and told them firmly, "Don't worry. I serve a Christ of power." Their faces were full of astonishment and confusion. Some thought I was delirious, but I knew I had witnessed a miracle. At that moment, I understood that God was not only healing me physically but that He was also restoring my spirit and renewing my purpose in life. I had experienced His power in a way that I could never deny. God showed me that when everything seems lost, He still has the last word. At that moment, when the hand of that wonderful character touched my forehead, I felt something I had never experienced before. It was as if a lightning bolt had struck me. Light went through my entire body, an electric shock ran through my being from head to toe, filling me with a strength and a heat that did not come from this world. It was as if the power of God was flowing directly to me. That divine touch not only impacted my body but also transformed my spirit. In an instant I understood that what is impossible for men is possible for God. Upon receiving that heavenly shock, my body reacted in a way that the doctors could not explain, defying the logic and gravity of my condition. I took my right hand from where they had secured me. With determination I took off the sash that covered my forehead, the same one that they had placed on me to move. Then without help I sat up on the stretcher. It was not a clumsy or weak movement. I got up with a force that could only come from above. The doctors and nurses who were present were stunned. Their faces reflected astonishment and confusion, but they could not understand what they were witnessing. As soon as I sat down, something supernatural began to happen. From my mouth I began to expel blood clots that had been accumulating in my brain for days, the same clots that specialists said required high-risk surgery to remove. We were now leaving my body as if an invisible hand was extracting them. Each expulsion was a miracle in itself, and while this was happening I felt my mind clear and my body strengthen. God was working in a way that no one could deny. While the doctors watched in disbelief, I began to speak to them. I told them firmly, the Christ that I preach has power. He is a God of wonders, a God who works when all seems lost. They looked at me not knowing what to say. Some murmured among themselves, trying to find a logical explanation, but there was no logic that could justify what they were seeing. One of them, still shocked, approached me and asked, "What is the name of this God that you serve?" Without hesitation I answered, "His name is Jesus of Nazareth." Another doctor, more skeptical, asked, "What religion do you belong to?" With a smile I told them, "I am not religious. I am a servant of Christ, because religion does not save. The only one who saves is Jesus, the one who died for us on the cross of Calvary." The doctors continued doing tests and studies. They wanted to understand how it was possible that the clotted blood in my brain was no longer there. One of them, God said, "This can't be. There is no connection between the brain and the mouth that allows clots to be expelled in this way." Another added, "What we are seeing, it is unusual. It has no scientific explanation." But for me everything was clear. It was the power of God manifesting in a tangible way. The Christ I serve had done what science considered impossible. They took me back to the studies to confirm what was already evident. The results were conclusive. There was no trace of the clots in my brain. The same doctors who had talked about operations and minimal chances of survival were now facing a reality that they could not explain. Some said it must be a mistake in the equipment. Others simply kept silent, but their looks said it all. They were witnessing a miracle while I continued to bear witness to what God had done in me. I told them that the Christ of power that I serve never fails. When all seems lost, He comes and changes everything. He is the one who opens doors when all are closed, who gives strength when there is nothing left. Although some were still skeptical, others began to listen attentively. They could not deny that something extraordinary had happened. One of the doctors, moved by curiosity, asked me, "How can I meet this Jesus you speak of?" I answered with love, "It is simple. You only have to open your heart and tell Him, 'Lord, here is my life. Make of me what you want.'" Those words touched something in him, and although he did not say it at that moment, I saw in his eyes that something had changed. The following days were equally surprising. According to the doctors, I had to remain in recovery for at least a month due to the severity of my fractures and injuries. They said that any sudden movement could cause a stroke or major complications. But each day that passed, my recovery advanced at a pace that they themselves described as abnormal. On the 10th day, one of the doctors told me, "Your case has no explanation. The only thing we know is that you are improving much faster than we expected." On the 11th day, another doctor said, "If you continue like this, tomorrow we will discharge you." Finally, on the 12th day I was discharged. I left the hospital walking on my own without needing help. The same doctors who had declared that I could not survive now saw me leave healthy and strong. As I left the hospital I could not stop thanking God. He had done a complete miracle in my life, not only healing my body but also renewing my spirit and my purpose. This testimony is not a story. It is not something that I dreamed or imagined. It is the living proof of the power of God. It is a reminder that when science says it is no longer possible, God says I can still. My brother, my friend, wherever you are listening to me, I want to tell you that the Christ of power who did this in me can also work in your life, because He is still the same yesterday, today and forever. It is worth serving Him. It is worth trusting in Him with gratitude and faith.